Memory. It's the key to our identity.
Without memory, we are nothing.
It's who we are.
Memory hackers. Right now.
Sometimes when I research a topic, the facts I find aren't exactly what I expect, so I just don't do the video. And that's something that almost happened with this one, but I kept digging and found some pretty neat information that I didn't expect, and that makes this story worth telling. A while ago, I was looking through the online archives of the Catholic Advance. I came across a 1951 commentary by Monsignor Matthew Stewart, whose content was syndicated through the Advance Register out of Denver. Monsignor Smith was commenting on a letter that appeared in the June 19, 1951 edition of a Protestant magazine called The Messenger. The Messenger was the official magazine of the Evangelical and Reformed Church, which was a predecessor denomination to the United Church of Christ. The letter was from Mrs. Joseph Haynes of Fredonia, Wisconsin. She was writing because she took offense to an article in The Messenger that suggested that Protestants needed a substitute for the reverence of the Catholic Mass and for Catholic rituals. Ironically, about a decade after the Messenger article, the Novus Ordo Church decided that Catholics needed a substitute for the Protestant form of worship, which was stripped of reverence and ritual. Mrs. Haynes proclaimed herself and her family as converted Roman Catholics, and in her letter she attacked the Mass. Monsignor Smith wrote, "It's obvious from what she writes that she did not understand the Mass, for she conceived of it as taking away direct communion of Christ." And that referred to this from Mrs. Haynes' letter. "Protestants take too lightly their privileges and the beauty of direct communion with Christ in a simple service." Monsignor Smith wrote, "I wonder how many times she received the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in Holy Communion. That is the most direct communion with Him in all of Christian worship. Belief in the real presence can establish an exquisite personal link between the soul and God, whether or not one present at the Mass actually receives communion." Mrs. Haynes wrote that when a new Protestant preacher came to town, he had the Bible, the Word of God, and the quotation, "God is love." To Mrs. Haynes, that was a revelation, to pray to God with faith and love because He loved us, and not through fear as in the Roman Catholic Church. Monsignor Smith replied, "Her idea of the Catholic Church is completely out of line with our intense spiritual doctrine of love that comes, for instance, through devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Blessed Sacrament, and the idea of Mary, the Mother, pleading for us with her Son." Mrs. Haynes wrote about the fear in the Catholic Church, where there is the constant fear of hell if you miss Mass or if you should die before confessing to a priest, and the fear of purgatory for those who have died. Mrs. Haynes scoffs at our fear of missing Mass, or dying without confession, or of going to purgatory. But if she knew the Scriptures, she would realize that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, though the firmer emphasis in the Catholic Church is on the power of love, not on fear of hellfire. Mrs. Haynes added that if you do away with all the laws of the Roman Church made by the Pope, the Mass, confession, rosary statues, adoration of Mary, the saints, then you have true worship. Mrs. Haynes shows little conception of the Catholic attitude toward the greatest of God's created persons, the Blessed Mother, when she speaks of our adoration of Mary. She ought to know we do not give the Blessed Virgin adoration, which belongs to God alone. Since an individual can pray to God, it is absurd to deny that a saint cannot petition Him for a fellow man as Mary does for us. The only good thing that Mrs. Haynes said about the Mass was that she seemed to acknowledge the reverence of the silent canon of the Mass. And ironically, when the Protestantized Novus Ordo Mass was instituted, it did away with the silent canon. Please see my video on the canon, which is linked down below. Monsignor Smith concluded by writing, "I would advise Mrs. Joseph Haynes and her family to seek a course of instruction from a Catholic priest. They left the Catholic Church because they did not know her. What they need is a knowledge of the Catechism." It seemed to me that since Mrs. Haynes knew so little about Catholicism, she probably never was a Catholic to begin with, so my initial plan was to use the resources that are available to us nowadays on the internet to do something similar to my videos that expose Sister Charlotte on my Catholic Urban Legends playlist. Mrs. Haynes' full name was Irene Haynes. Her maiden name was Kramer. When I found her obituary, I thought that I had all the evidence I needed. It said that she had been playing organ in her Protestant church since she was 14 years old. She continued playing organ there for 50 years. But I continued to dig into it, and it turned out that Mrs. Haynes was baptized as a Catholic, but her mother died when she was only 4 years old, and her father remarried a few years later in a Catholic church, but then he moved to Milwaukee with his new wife and left Irene to be raised by her grandparents, who were also Catholic, but they were elderly and likely didn't have much control over Irene. And this is witnessed by the fact that she was playing organ during Protestant worship services, which was a violation of the Code of Canon Law of 1917 and would certainly have been very scandalous. Irene did get married in a Catholic church, probably at the insistence of her grandparents, but she quickly apostatized completely. After learning this, I almost abandoned working on this video, but I read this from Mrs. Haynes' letter to the messenger. Even our evangelical and Reformed church building was a former Catholic edifice. From the Sheboygan Times, I learned that her Protestant church was St. Paul's Community United Church of Christ. Since it was an old building, there is this information about it on the WisconsinHistoricalMarkers.com website. The solid stone structure was erected in 1872 as a Catholic church. The Catholic parish continued to operate until the early 1900s when bankruptcy forced it to cease operations. So this part of Mrs. Haynes' letter was truthful, and it also seemed to have a very sad ending to this story. But Mrs. Haynes' letter continued. Even our evangelical and Reformed church building was a former Catholic edifice, stripped, of course, of all its former baubles, the use of which is a custom handed down from the old Jewish and pagan forms of worship, and the very things which Christ in his simplicity of worship showed us are not needed. So basically, she was saying that the church was desecrated, and she seemed very happy about it. However, the Wisconsin Historical Markers website adds, in 2005, the building returned to its roots when Our Lady of the Rosary, Roman Catholic Church, purchased the building. And you scroll down on the page and you see this image. Please note that this church has a traditional Tridentine Mass. And if you Google the church, you can see this photo of the inside of it. There is no altar for a priest facing the people. It has been restored and is mostly as it had been before the church was ever desecrated. So maybe back in 1951, Mrs. Haynes could boast that the church was stripped of all its statues and rich symbolism. But the tables have turned, and today the church has been restored. The statues and symbolism have returned. A couple of videos, I mentioned that there are no happy endings in the Novus Ordo Church. It is destined to implode upon itself. But here we have a happy ending. It is a precursor to the restoration of all things that are good and profitable. It is a reminder of Christ's promise, I will not leave thee, neither will I forsake thee. It truly is always darkest before the dawn. Keep praying for the church and a return of all things good and profitable.
Further on up the road, someone gonna hurt you like you hurt me. And farther on up the road, someone gonna hurt you like you hurt me. Farther on up the road, baby, you just wait and see.